That's funny. We're good now with sound? We're on. Okay, now we have sound. Hello, everybody. I hope this works. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Hello. We have sound now. Very good. Welcome, everybody, to the show that has sound and fury and lots of great mischief. Very good to have everyone here. This is Torn Tuesday, starting a little bit later than usual, but better than never. It takes a lot of gremlins in the microwave to get this new 4K version of the show that was we were streaming a couple of weeks from the location of Scum and Villainy Cantina, our home of a couple of years. Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're now live here in my living room with a very special guest who is joining us this week on our live stream, Torn Tuesday, which is our playful acronym for the One Ring.net. Welcome aboard. This is the website or the web portal that has, for the past 20 years, been the place forged by and for the fans of J.R.R. Tolkien. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. My name is Clifford Broadway, veteran writer, writer and mischief maker on the OneRing.net, and also the producer, co-writer of Ringers, Lord of the Fans, which is coming back very soon in a new high-definition version. Very exciting. Our guest today, none other than the Tolkien professor himself. Give a big round of applause, everybody, in the live chat for Corey Olsen, Tolkien professor. He is here, coming to us from the distant lands of Imladris.
That's right, from the fair valley of Rivendell here this evening.
This is magic to have the Tolkien professor actually here live with us on our show. It's so good to have you here. And where do folks generally tune in to hear a Tolkien professor podcast? Tell us.
Well, there are lots of options. We have several different podcast feeds for people who prefer audio only. We also have a YouTube channel, the Signum University YouTube channel. Almost all of my content is up there. And of course, people can also subscribe to our Twitch channel, which is twitch.tv/SignumU, where you can catch a lot of, almost all of my broadcasts I do live from there.
Fantastic. So good to have you here, brother. Brothers in arms, Tolkien fans unite. We have a show, and boy, do we have news, because last week we had a unique technical problem where we didn't get a show running at all. It was a mess. But now, thank you, Justin Sewell, who is diligently working in the background, doing all the gremlins in the microwave, and it's working out nicely. We have such huge casting announcements. There was a wave of actors and, of course, obvious connections to Shortland Street, because everybody in New Zealand who's ever acted has always been on that bloody TV show, Shortland Street. Even, before you could graduate to the venerated cast of Hercules or Xena, Warrior Princess, if you worked in New Zealand, you had to work on Shortland Street. And here we are 20 years later, it hasn't changed. It has not changed at all. But isn't that exciting to have Amazon Studios suddenly, divulge so much huge casting information?
Suddenly releasing information? Yeah, that's very exciting.
Yeah, releasing any information at all, because
right.
A couple of weeks before that, we were looking at spy photos of this strange ice wall and this huge set. And we've been scratching our heads with, consternation and maybe a fair share of, confusion, trying to figure out what's up. What's your first impression of this wave of casting?
Well, I mean, one thing that was really interesting, I was, one question, of course, in my mind, and this is, from a movie casting standpoint, a very sort of, amateur kind of question, was like, what kind of cast were they going to go for? Was this going to be like a sort of a Marvel film kind of, let's bring in lots of, celebrity names kind of thing for some roles? Or was this going to be more like Peter Jackson did, having more sort of local actors and sort of more kind of unknown people? And it seems like they've certainly leaned more towards the latter, in that there's not a lot of big huge names on that list. I mean, my first reaction, I read through the list and I'm like, yep, Never heard of any of them. That's probably a good thing, actually. It's kind of exciting. When I did a little bit more digging, I did find there were some that I knew, but my first look through, I'm like, wow, okay, List of Strangers. That's really interesting.
Do you know how many of my friends said the exact same thing?
Yeah.
One of my closest friends, who works in the movies and Blu-ray department at Amoeba Music, and his job is to know movies rather well and recommend them for the home theater enthusiast. As soon as I sent him the casting announcement, he said, "I don't know a single bloody one of those people," and that's wonderful.
Yeah. 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 No, it was really exciting. And, and the couple people that upon like actually reading their bios, I realized I had, seen before, or people who are, really like new upcoming people like I'm forgetting her name already. The woman who played Mina in the Netflix Dracula just this past year.
Oh, yes.
Uh,
Um, oh, um,
Morvith, what's her name?
Clark.
Yes. Morvith Clark.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So she was like one of the only people who, upon further research, I found that I had actually seen her in something. But again, she's a really interesting, sort of exciting new name, which has, clearly been starting to generate some buzz in the film world here in the last 2 years. But, not somebody who's certainly a household name yet. So that's really interesting.
When I hear that misnomer of young Galadriel
Right.
attached to her, I want to stop in my tracks and say, wait, she is over 7,000 years old by the time
Right.
we meet her in the War of the Ring. Is that not? So
yeah, no, exactly. Young Galadriel, they'd have to be going back pretty far to actually get young
really?
Galadriel. I mean, her in the middle of the Second Age, she's slightly younger, but not really a very significant proportion of her life.
From some of the information we get in the later volumes of the History of Middle-earth series, we learn some very interesting thoughts that Tolkien had about the lifespan, about the metaphysical connection of the soul to the body of elves, and the way they cook bread, the way they organize marriages and structures of society.
Yes.
Is that where we learn the basics of how quickly an immortal being, such as one of the Eldar, would reach a level of quote unquote physical maturity?
Yes. The first time he talks about that kind of thing is in it's in Morgoth's Ring. The laws and customs among the Eldar section, which I always, we just did a full discussion through Morgoth's Ring in my Mythgard Academy series, and I was saying at the time, I really think that Christopher Tolkien undersold that section of that book. Like, I mean, I would have, put it like Morgoth's Ring featuring the laws and customs among the Eldar. I mean, it's an amazing work. It's really, a lot of people don't kind of realize this, because Tolkien, of course, has a wonderful and very well-deserved reputation for his world building, for the detail of his world building. But a lot of people don't realize how eclectic it grew, how eclectically it grew, and even how late it grew. I mean, it was not until then, after he had written The Lord of the Rings, that he really began to do some of what most people would consider basic world building about elves. I mean, he knew nothing about the culture of elves. He had written stuff for decades, all those legends and things for decades, and he'd never answered some of those basic questions that you're talking about. How often, how usual is it for them to get married? When do they get married? How does, childbearing work? And how does child rearing happen among the elves? And how fast do they grow? And all of those kinds of things. He had never even, it seemed never even really to think about that much, other than how it was incidentally involved in some of the stories themselves. So he sits down finally after writing The Lord of the Rings, working out some of this stuff. And so when you get there when you're reading Morgoth's Ring, and Christopher buries it in the middle of like commentary on this like revision of that Tolkien's revision and development of the second marriage issue with Finwë and Miriel and I mean all that whole like the whole divorce and remarriage thing, which is what in Tolkien's, Christopher's following Tolkien's like progress, right? How this kind of all came to him, and how it, how he ended up writing all this stuff. But the result is he buries it like in the middle of a chapter, like in the midst of a boring section of Morgoth's Ring.
Funny? But I mean, you can't. I mean, you're right. It is some of the most valuable stuff for world building, and to look at the way Tolkien's mind worked in an elliptical way, sometimes forwards and then sometimes backwards,
Yes.
around the same subject.
Yes.
If that's fair to say. When I wrote a big piece for Deviant Art a few years ago, and I described Professor Tolkien as a tourist in his own world who was accidentally discovering things as he was going along.
Absolutely.
As a kind of a funny analogy. And you're right in that, saying that the connective tissue of what would have been in the writer's Bible for anybody else writing today, all that stuff would have been built and written way, way, way up front.
Yes.
And Tolkien figured it out at his leisure later on when he thought it through, which I find endlessly fascinating, really.
Yes, yes. And I love it when he does that in response to...
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and I particularly love it when he does it in response to reader questions. You can see this in his letters, right? Yeah. Where, to follow your tourist analogy, it's like somebody asks him a question, and instead of saying, trying to do like, J.K. Rowling might do, being like, well, here's the authoritative answer that I could, instead he's like essentially, I don't know, let's look and see, so he, and the kid just kind of discovers it, and you can almost feel it that he's while he's writing the letter, he's discovering the answer to the question.
Indeed, that's wonderful. That is wonderful. I've always liked that about getting deep into those unpublished manuscripts that Christopher had unearthed. And I just find that really cool and kind of weird that Tolkien figured it out in a very organic way that was suitable for his own interests. He wasn't doing it by pressure of publishers' demands or a habit of 21st century fantasy writers, because he was just kind of interested in exploring these own things himself for his own intellectual pursuits, until other people jogged him and fan letters made him go and explore these things. But I mean, ultimately, back to the young Galadriel joke, to me, that you get to an age of maturity with the Eldar at what, 34?
Like he said, they're like fully grown at about 50-ish. It's like you'd probably still be the equivalent of a moody elvish teenager at 35, probably. I would think.
Okay. So if people think that Morfydd Clark is going to come in and play second age Galadriel, as if she was significantly younger Galadriel in that psychology or frame of mind, that's just not going to happen. I want to put a squash on that. Okay. I really do.
No, I mean, it's like, so somebody who's only like 5,000 years old instead of 8,000 years old, basically. I mean, it's younger, but
that's true. Well, the cast includes so many great names from theater. The world of theater has leaned in heavily now into the world of television. Not surprising during COVID.
Sure.
That these theater actors are going for other television jobs now. Really.
Yeah, and that I think is actually really exciting. I remember that was one of the things, back in the day, when the Jackson casting was coming out, seeing so many of, he drew fairly heavily on stage, stage actors too, in some cases, and many of those were just wonderful. So I think it's really exciting.
Let's look at Augustus Prew. It was one of the names that had been thrown around quite a lot, because everybody remembers his debut in About a Boy when he was just a kid, but now he's all grown up, and he's been in a lot of TV series like Prison Break in 2017. Over the past few years, he'd been in Los Angeles, working on some really interesting shows, and this play that he did, The Frame, caught a lot of critical attention, and so Augustus Prew, there, and all these other great names, these people are coming on board with what, like my friend and like you and I basically said, oh, we don't know these people because we haven't been in I haven't stepped foot in a UK theater in many, many, many years,
Yes.
or a
Yes.
New Zealand theater. It's been so long. So it's not to say that these people don't have chops, but
Right.
now we get to guess, blind guesswork and blind speculation of what kind of characters in the Second Age, including um, men and regular men who are not Numenorian, and then there's the real Numenorians coming and going, colonizing different areas of Arda. If they're going across many thousands of years across the Second Age, we could end up anywhere on this planet.
Yes. Yes.
Um, which helps explain some of this great diversity that we're seeing in some of these casting choices. I'm really excited. Uh, where to begin? Where to begin?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I mean, it is really challenging um, to guess because the potential scope of the the show idea is so vast. I
Yes.
mean, we could be covering more than 1,000 years of Middle Earth history in season 1 for all we know. And it does open up massive possibilities, and I don't even know to what extent they're going to, because so for instance, there are we know they're doing earlier stuff, right? They're obviously doing Second Age stuff.
Mhm.
So, but is that only a matter of starting the Lord of the Rings story at the forging of the rings, but still sort of sticking sort of narrowly to the main line of the Numenorian story leading up to with Gilgalad, and then ultimately culminating in the War of the Last Alliance, which then from there will follow kind of narrowly, or maybe jump most of the Third Age or whatever. I don't know what the plan is, but again, that is to what extent, even though they're starting early, you could imagine a version of it where they still primarily stick to, in a sense, the main Lord of the Rings story, right? Like the sort of the main line of the War of the Rings, both of the Wars of the Rings, basically, and
Yeah.
the kind of thread in between them. But it's not necessary that they would have to restrict themselves in that way. There are lots of storylines, which of course are only implied, some implied very vaguely, which would make really interesting theater, which would be really fun to watch. So like, for instance, you mentioned the Numenorian journeys and explorations and colonizations, right? I
Mhm.
could imagine a sort of plot line developing for Harad and Rune, where the unfaithful Numenor, right, where the Kingsmen were based more, to sort of
Yeah.
show the story of, because I mean the story of what was happening in Rune and Harad, we know a few very basic things about the outlines, right, of what was sort of happening there. It's not quite as simple as people tend to think of it, right? I mean, people often tend to think like, well, Sauron had Rune and Harad in his pocket, and they were, supplying his armies, but there's more to it than that, right? I mean, the hints
Of
that he
course.
gives about the Blue Wizards suggest there's more to it than that.
Well, much
Um,
more. And of
yeah,
course, the idea that Morgoth had been influencing the men of the East
yes,
millennia before Sauron, and
right,
Sauron was just able to go in there and reap some of that energy that his big daddy Morgoth had sown from a greater time way before. Now, and of course, that's always fascinating to me. That
yes.
that ties in with the Blue Wizards, who were rewritten so specifically by Professor Tolkien. I think. Tell me if you think I'm crazy, but I know you, Professor Olson. You tell me if I'm crazy, but
Okay.
I'm in I'm going to stand on this hill when it comes to people wanting to say that the men of the East were corrupted or were easily corrupted,
Mhm.
um, or because they're a different race. But no, I don't think Professor Tolkien was at any point interested in observing and dissecting racial tensions and race relations. He was much more interested in metaphysical
Yes.
failings of his characters
Yes.
and the metaphysical failings of an entire group of people with a culture cemented in fear of Morgoth and worshiping Morgoth from very, very, very early on.
Yes.
I think Professor Tolkien wanted to rewrite his Blue Wizards to engage this larger concept that these two Maya, excuse me, plural, would have such a larger agenda of a larger canvas to help be a corrective to the spiritual problems of the men of the East, the Far East, and in Rune and in the Harad as well. Don't you
Yes.
think there might be some meat and potatoes to that idea?
I do. I really do. I mean, it's pretty clear. Again, this is also in Morgoth's Ring, near the end of Morgoth's Ring, when he was primarily talking about orcs and kind of trying to deal with the orc problem, which he never really solved. But anyway, the in that context, he spoke a little bit about the people of Rune and Harad, and one of the things that he emphasized was basically there was Sauron had a lot of work to do because he didn't just have to recruit people, right? He had to get the people of Rune and Harad to not just to enlist, right, in the armies or agree to be impressed into the armies or whatever. He didn't just have to, but he had to have them come up and be okay fighting shoulder to shoulder with orcs. For the men of Harad to come marching up, see the armies of orcs that they have to camp next to, and be like, yeah, that's okay. These are our compatriots. We're fighting the good cause together. He basically said, in order to get the people of Rune and Harad in that kind of condition, he had to spiritually corrupt them. Yes. To a very significant extent. It was a long period of work through things like the kinds of atrocities that are talked about in Numenor, for instance, the human sacrifices and stuff like that, where that he would have had to spiritually degrade these people to the point where they were willing to again be alongside orcs and be totally fine with that. It's not just a matter of propaganda. That would not have served to be able to do the job. And the sort of the premise underlying that is exactly as you say, the situation. He's certainly not imagining the people of Rune and Harad as just some kind of racially inferior group of people who are naturally prone to corruption in this way. Sauron had to act on them, which means the people of Harad, of Rune and Harad, are Sauron's victims, at least as much, if not more so. I mean, they are, if anything, the instructive example of what would happen in the West if Sauron were not restrained, right? So and this is why, again, you can see the beginning glimpses of this even in the Lord of the Rings itself, when the people of the Haradrim who surrender are spared, and the slaves are freed, you can see that there is this impulse already towards saying even his human allies are not being defeated so much as they're being liberated by the defeat of Sauron. And it's not going to go smoothly. There's still going to be resistance because, again, he did have to bring them to a place where they were completely bought in, where they were, entrenched in probably generations of this cult worship, the cult of Sauron down in their lands. And there's still going to be strongholds of that cult there, and so, the wars that Aragorn and Éomer are said to have been fighting for many years after the War of the Ring, that mentioned in Appendix A. I always imagined that's what it was, that there were still centers of the worship of Sauron, where, of course, the priesthood of Sauron was not ready to let go just because Sauron was gone. And so for their own political purposes, they held on and they had to be defeated. And by that means, again, the people freed. And that is exactly the kind of work that I do see him thinking about more with his later development of the Blue Wizards. I say development, it's mostly just their names, right? Is the only thing the hint that we get about the work that they were doing.
Let's pronounce them carefully, because the older names were LOTR and Palando. The newer names were Romestamo and
oh, I'm forgetting.
See, now I gotta look it up. Don't worry, somebody in the chat will tell us instantly. Someone will tell us.
In the live sorry, chat. I'm blanking on it.
It's okay. On
it. Well, the fiery glow is a little suggestive. Do we think
the later writings for the Blue Wizards say that there were pockets of Easterlings that were not into the Sauron worship,
right? Who resisted?
They were not really that into it,
right? And that the work of the Blue Wizards was to undermine Sauron's work,
Sauron's efforts, and that made their work. There it is. Thank you, live chat. Morinitar.
Morenitar. Yeah, I thought it began with an M, but I couldn't call it up.
Or Morinitar and Romestamo. Those those two blue wizards actually were revised to not have appeared in the Third Age when Gandalf and Radagast and Saruman slash Kurunir showed up.
Mhm.
If Amazon Studios is licensing some of that older material that Tolkien was revising and reworking later in his life, then we legitimately will be able to maybe, I'm saying maybe, ladies and gentlemen, we might be able to see and have it still be canon. We might be able to see blue wizards appear
Mhm.
in this TV series. But under no means whatsoever should we have Gandalf or Saruman or Radagast show up in the Second Age. But the blue wizards
Right.
might.
Right. Yeah, I mean, he did kind of waffle on when and how the Astari got. I mean, like when he had Gandalf coming separately, they coming together, and then he had Gandalf coming separately. So it is conceivable that he could have sent in a couple advanced scouts there. It is conceivable. But yeah, people do forget that the wizards were a Third Age phenomenon. It's easy to kind of think back, because so much of the rest of the cast is the same, right? We think about Elrond and Galadriel and Gil-galad and the other great elf lords, many of whom we know or have heard of. And it's easy to kind of, one tends to lump Gandalf in with Galadriel and Elrond, right? And so when we're in Círdan, right? So when we're thinking back to that period, sometimes it's easy to kind of momentarily forget that, of course, Gandalf not there. So
Wow, I'm telling you that if the fans find out that they get to watch this new TV series and they get to encounter two more wizards that they've never ever encountered before, the stuff will hit the fan. Everybody will be so excited. It will be like, whoa, the coolest new thing on the block. That
I
will be
think it's a
genuine
really,
excitement for that.
yeah, I think it's a really exciting possibility. And so I mean, just like to go back to the bigger question, the scope of the stories that are available, that are possible with, or at least that, and that they've opened up the door to by starting back when they did, right? Instead of starting at the long expected party, to go all the way back into the Second Age and begin the whole, again, the first War of the Ring, back in the Second Age. That opens up so many possibilities, and I don't know how focused they're going to be looking to be in the, for their main plot line, how much of this extra stuff they're wanting to do, or whether they would even do, I don't know, spin-offs or what. I have no idea what their plans are, but it would be, there's just some really interesting possibilities.
There's a lot of speculation about where in the Second Age timeline they're going to begin.
Mm-hmm.
But always remember, because Peter Jackson did it many times, you can cut away instantly to a flashback 1,000 years earlier.
Right.
So they might be able to even concurrently run some timelines if they want to run them together.
Right.
In a weird
Absolutely.
way.
Well, I mean,
Magic of editing.
Yeah. I mean, my guess, and it's only a guess. I mean, the only information
I'd love to hear it. I would love to hear your guess
on. Right. My guess is we're going to be looking at the time when Celebrimbor is making, like the Anatar period is my guess for when it begins, especially since that coincides with and from a Númenórean perspective, from Eldarion, right, and his friendship with Gil-galad, and therefore, because that's really the beginning of the time when Númenor is for the first time really kind of drawn back into the events over in Middle Earth. Pre-Eldarion, Númenor is isolated. I mean, they're just, they do some exploring and stuff, but even that doesn't really take off until after Eldarion. So, but again, with the Gil-galad connection there, to be able to bring in Gil-galad as the kind of central, I mean, he's the High King, right? So, the sort of central captain figure who's on guard against the rise of Sauron, and who's the first one to be picking up on the growth of the shadow and expressing concerns about this Anatar chap and what's going on. That seems like a very logical place to begin. Because if you go much before that in the Second Age, again, you've got Sauron just kind of taking shape and not doing very much. You've got
Yeah.
the Numenorian dynasty happening, and Numenor becoming greater and more wonderful, but not doing much. Again, very, very isolated.
Mhm.
The plot really begins to happen
We
at that time.
we have to see Anatar show up first in the Blue Mountains at is it Fort Linden? He has to
Yes,
show up and try to introduce himself to Gil-galad, and
right.
Elrond has to be there, and they
Yep,
have to say no
right.
and shut the door in his face. We have to have that moment where Anatar gets the bum's rush
Absolutely.
from
What?
Gil-galad before he goes over to introduce himself to Celebrimbor
Right.
over out, right outside the gates of Holland, right?
Yes. Yes. One of the things I am hoping for most, I am really hoping for a lot of Gil-galad. I think that Gil-galad is one of
Yeah,
the coolest characters who never gets a story told about him. I mean, other
yeah,
than like the bare presence that he gets in I mean, that what like the total amount of narrative we get about Gil-galad is like less than a page. I mean, it's tiny, this little snippets, random sentences in accounts of the, but
mhm,
he was the longest ruling High King of the Noldor ever. Like
yeah,
the other High Kings of the Noldor didn't last nearly as long as he did. He had
yeah.
this really long and important reign, and there, even like some of the small sentences that we get are so tantalizing about how, like, when Sauron returns from Numenor and discovers that Gil-galad's power had greatly increased. What did that mean? What did he do? What did Gil-galad do? Like, how did Gil-galad's power increase? What was he doing to proactively begin, like putting the continent on guard against, preparing for the return of Sauron that he obviously foresaw? I mean, and then of course his partnership with Elrond. Elrond was his
Oh
right hand
gosh,
guy
yeah,
for ages, and
yeah.
that's, I mean, that whole story. I would love to have. So I'm really hoping that Gil-galad is going to be a pretty major character in the first season of the series.
Of great interest to me is Gil-galad's mentorship of Elrond.
Yes, absolutely,
That
absolutely.
relationship, and to see parallels between Elros and Elrond, because after they make their very important metaphysical decision
Yep.
to live different destinies and have different spiritual outcomes, all of a sudden, if the writers are doing what they should be doing in the writers' room, they could parallel these two brothers throughout many seasons, and it could be magnificent. It
Yeah.
really could be magnificent.
It's yeah. I mean, there's so much there, and I agree.
But
Elrond is also one of those characters. I mean, it's not like we don't know anything about Elrond, but
yeah,
he's always in the background, right? And we get some dialogue from him, we get some scenes with him, but
yeah,
we don't get like narrative of, like, here's a story of something that Elrond did. We get very little of that, comparatively little, compared to the size of the, like, he's such an important figure, right? Such a big
mm,
and prominent figure in the
mm.
story, and yet he's a stationary figure, except for when he comes out to give away his daughter, right? Apart from that, he's just sitting there in Imladris and not doing anything. But so yeah, to have him, to really be setting him up as a character, to show Gil-galad as his mentor,
Mm.
and the ways in which he's kind of learning from him and helping him and what they're doing together, and the original founding of Imladris, which is really like almost more like a military outpost than it was like a retreat center, which is kind of what it looks like by the time we get there. But anyway, no, it's really fascinating stuff. So
Um,
yeah,
Indeed, it is totally fascinating. But in terms of Elros, who becomes the first king of Numenor, I think it's fair to say that in that larger story of Numenor, people are way more interested in the last king of Numenor, not the first one,
right,
because
right.
that's where most of the meat and potatoes of the tragedy happens, the real tragedy. Who are either Elrond or Elros in this screenshot? Well, they were twins, so you could have one actor playing both of them. That's possible. It is
That would be
possible.
that would be really interesting.
Oh, let me turn on my mic. Robert
Robert
Arameo
Arameo, that's right.
is the
Now,
second to last face, and he is rumored to be Elrond.
Really?
The young man who was in Game of Thrones.
He replaced Will Poulter, who was originally cast as young Elrond.
Yes. Now,
Arameo,
stop
you
with
said?
that young Elrond euphemism.
Yes. Robert Arameo from Game
Yes.
of Thrones replaced Will Poulter, and
did.
it is rumored that he is young Elrond. Which, do you think they would cast the same actor, or do you think Fraternal Twins is good enough for a TV show?
No.
I think it depends.
People expect twins to be played by the same actor. They love it all the time. They love it. People love that.
I think it depends on how, probably depends on how much they do with Elros. I suspect. That is, are they going to want to differentiate them as characters in any way? I don't know. I mean, they certainly can do the same actor. They are twins, and so that certainly is an opportunity to do that and to play on that. Yeah. Okay. So Robert Arameo had a very small role in Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
He's young Neddard Stark in the flashbacks. Yes.
Yes, in flashbacks. Yeah, I had to look it up because I have a pretty good memory for faces. I don't usually remember people's names, but usually when I've seen someone in something, I'll be able to place it. And I was looking at him and I'm like, nope, don't remember him from Game of Thrones. Of course, the flashbacks. That's why I didn't remember it.
I hear people screaming Charles Dance all the time, wanting him to be in this series, in this Amazon series. I hear it all the time. So let's just speculate for 2 seconds. Who could Charles Dance possibly play? I think he'd be a mighty good Ar-Pharazôn.
Okay. So yeah. So have him in as the villain in the end there.
And what a great villain! Completely corrupted by Anatar, being absolutely horrid. I can see it. I can see it happening. But that's just me.
Actually, okay. Well, see, this might be too close to just typecasting him, but I could see him playing our Gimilchor, our Pharazôn's dad, actually.
Oh, really?
The one who gets passed over, who thinks he should be king, but gets kind of passed over, and he ends up dying comparatively young. But he's this like embittered outsider scheming for his son and like putting all of the political pieces into place so that when our Pharazôn is ready to make his move, our Gimilchor, his father, has like set everything up for him. But again, having him be like the older political manipulator is probably a little bit too on the nose. But
that sounds cool. That sounds really great. That's awesome. From the chat, RJ McReady is asking both of us, do we see the possibility of multiple spin-off series or shows if the first main series is successful? Especially now that Lucasfilm just did that wild Disney Investors Day announcement, which blew everyone's minds. But I think in answer to RJ's question, you could think of this project as a pyramid, and the capstone at the top of the pyramid would be the main second age series. But underneath that, you could have a lot of other auxiliary products / auxiliary shows that are branching out underneath that. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. Would you?
Me neither. And if those things are done well, it could be really excellent. I mean, my biggest complaint about the Peter Jackson films, which I'm sure I share with many people, though it might sound counterintuitive to some others who complained at the time when they were released, was that they were far too short, right? I mean, he did a marvelous job of telling the story within the scope that he had, but it's obviously a story that is not really suited for brief feature films. You can't do there's so much that had to be trimmed in the narrative in order to do that. And so
as opposed to The Hobbit, where everything suffered from continuing expansion and ballooning of a shorter story.
Though even that, like an expanded Hobbit is a fine idea, but it was still like a rushed and disjointed expanded Hobbit, essentially, is still what we got, whereas again, like, so my very first reaction to the announcement of the Amazon series way back when was simple, like delight that we were finally going to get this kind of long form storytelling, adaptation, which is what I have been. I mean, I know like this didn't really exist as a form, at least not as a popular form, back at the turn of the millennium when Peter Jackson was doing this. But this is a really wonderful opportunity, I think, to be able to give real scope to the story. And that's what I want. And again, so the second thing that delighted me is the fact that they were obviously they're doing second age stuff, from their maps and everything, which tells me they're not in a hurry, right? They're if they're going to start the story of the Lord of the Rings back at the forging of the ring, fantastic. That means they're wanting to do 4,000 year version of the Lord of the Rings story. Excellent. It would really stand up to that kind of treatment. There's plenty of story to get multiple seasons of really compelling arcs out of that story. I think that's really excellent. And certainly it would enable spin-offs, right? So, I mean, the stuff we were talking about before with Rune and Harad and the Blue Wizards, that is an ideal spin-off series, right? To get the adventures of, to focus on one of the actions of one or both of the Blue Wizards in the East, as they're kind of working to undermine the cult of Sauron. And what maybe one of them fails and one of them succeeds, and who knows? Like, there's lots and lots of story that could be uncovered there, and I think that would be and to even to begin that from the days of Numenorian imperialization, and then the sort of the rule of the Black Numenorians, and there's so much there, and there are many different elements like that that could easily become, while the kind of main series sticks to the main thread, many other kind of spin-off opportunities. I mean, you could get a whole series, several seasons of like Arnor and the Arnorian civil wars, for instance.
Yeah, totally. Oh my God, because there's no place to fit all of that in if you're talking about Celebrimbor and Anatar and ultimately the War of the Elves and Sauron. Yeah. There's no place to even fit the whole conversation of Gondor and Arnor, because that happens so much later, and yet it's one of the greatest untold chapters.
Question from the chat. We've got a question from the chat, actually several questions. And
okay, but before we get to those questions, I would actually like to say that additional series that could happen could, like the Blue Wizards that you just mentioned, could also conceivably cover hobbits, because there are no hobbits. And Amazon might be thinking, we have a problem, folks. We're making a multi-billion-dollar, multi-season series, and we have no halflings. We have no hobbits at all. What are we going to do?
For a long time.
So I think that in and of itself, because they've chosen to tell the story of the Second Age, it is ripe for a much bigger conversation that maybe an animated series or other things to let us go back into the Shire in the Third Age and have a whole different level of understanding hobbits and other characters yet unexplored. I think we have room for that. And go ahead, Justin, with questions from the chat.
Well, there's a bunch of comments in the chat, and it's a difficult conversation and we've been having it for several years now, and it's not going away, and it's valid because Tolkien wrote his stories when he wrote them. What do you think of the diverse casting that we've seen so far? And to Cliff's point, are people going to get mad that there's no hobbits in here, but we have all this woke casting for no other reason to be a modern show in a medieval time? And is there a response? Like, how do we address this?
Well, there is the danger for it to be mischaracterized as woke casting, and that's just a pit. It's an unfortunate pitfall where you don't want to break your ankle when you're taking your first step out the door. Okay, the conversation really is about expanding to so many other areas of Arda before it gets changed from flat to round. And having so many great people of color has everything to do with the Numenorians voyaging far and wide and encountering the fact that there's so many other interesting people in Arda, and Morgoth got there first. Challenge on, spiritual challenge accepted. It's not about race, people. Let's get that through your heads. Let's
No,
start
it's
there.
not about race. Tolkien was not, as you say, there were people, of course, who were very interested in different kind of racial theories in the early part of the 20th century. That was a very prominent thing. That was
Yeah.
not Tolkien's thing. He was not interested in that stuff in general. So yeah, I agree with you. And as far as, here's the other thing that people have to remember. This is something I mentioned earlier on in the context of elves, how a lot of the sort of world building details of Tolkien's story kind of grew as he discovered them as he went along. This is true not only of things like the history and culture of elves, but even with things like the geography of Middle Earth. It wasn't until later on, after he'd written The Lord of the Rings, that he said things like, well, Minas Tirith is at about the latitude of Venice, right? And it's like Italian, and then Umbar is at about the latitude of Carthage, right? So, which means when you look at the maps, Dol Amroth is around the latitude of like Morocco, basically, right? So it is not merely like we're trying to go out of our way to shoehorn minorities into the casting to say, I mean, like if you were to cast a dark-skinned Prince Imrahil, it would be absolutely in keeping with what Tolkien described about the geography of his world. Like it would. Like that's now. It's interesting though. There is a difference, right? There's a difference. There's a distinction. Like Tolkien never described that, but of course he almost never describes people's faces and skin at all. Like he doesn't talk about people's. I mean, what color eyes does Frodo have? Like, I mean, we do. There's so many things we don't know because he spends much time describing landscape, very little time describing people. But when he did lay out the world as he was imagining it, certainly as he was coming to imagine it in more and more detail in the years after he published The Lord of the Rings, it became clear that a view of the peoples of Middle Earth, of the people even of just of the west of Middle Earth, like especially when we're talking about Gondor. Now, are the Rohirrim primarily sort of Nordic looking? Yes, because they are Northmen who came wandering down. So that seems to me perfectly legit and in line.
And they speak Old English because Professor Tolkien was writing about his linguistic interests.
Right,
He was
exactly.
not interested in race wars or
like the Anglo-Saxon race or anything like that. Yes.
It was linguistic interests that drove Tolkien to populate the framework of his stories the way that he did.
Absolutely.
So again, it's not racial. Just to remind everyone.
Yeah, not to mention that Numenor itself is practically equatorial.
Yes.
I mean, is there a reason everyone in Numenor who lived in Numenor for 3,000 years should be white? I mean, is there any reason to expect that? Geographically speak, I mean, there is, I mean, again, we kind of have a choice, right? It is true that certainly in the imaginations of many readers, Tolkien's characters are all white. He didn't insist on that. And indeed, did he imagine them white? I bet he probably did, but we don't know for sure in most cases. But in any case, when he goes to dig into developing the world and explaining the geography of Middle Earth, it absolutely opens the door to and shows that, as you say, he's not thinking about race. He's not, it was not a major factor for him.
I've heard it said by our wonderful staff writer and host of the Happy Hobbit series, Kelly Rice, who's an author who's really established herself quite well. Kelly Rice was with us, seated on a San Diego Comic-Con panel. It may have been at WonderCon in Anaheim, and we had early conversation about people of color and a diversity casting in this upcoming series. And this was 2 years ago, so we were fully in speculation mode. But Kelly said something that struck me as remarkably erudite. And I wanted to bring this up because in that era of Middle Earth, which could be comparable to, pre-Iron Age, to our history,
right?
Perhaps, in our primary world, at that period of time, it was not race that caused mistrust between different tribes or nations. It was a linguistic breakdown. When there was a breakdown in languages and you could not understand the people across the river and across the mountains, you could not trade with them. You could not trust them because you didn't understand if they were jerking around with the weights and measurements to measure
Right.
the grain.
Right.
Linguistic, it was all languages that caused strife amongst the earliest civilizations of people. And I would damn well not be surprised at all that Professor Tolkien was very, very much aware of that. And that,
Yes.
you know, I mean, you do get an insight that Tolkien had this in his mind when he was creating his world, because language and the differences between people are never more starkly drawn in that relief. And
Right.
what do you think of Kelly's observation about that?
I agree. I mean, I think you can see evidence of that even as far back as the Tower of Babel story in Genesis, right? The idea of by dividing the languages of the people, they were then divided and could not come together again.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean that certainly seems to be an idea that is deeply rooted in ancient culture, and that seems to me very likely. So yeah, I no. So here's the question. So as far as like depicting humans of color, right? That seems to me simple. Again, I would expect if you follow what Tolkien actually said about the geography of Middle Earth, you know, the people of almost none of the native people in Gondor should have white skin. I mean, it's like that's not what Tolkien described as far as the geography goes. If we sort of are using real world parallels, what do you think about elves? You know, the assumption that elves are all white skinned is an almost universal assumption.
Is it only because of the use of the word fair?
Well, and the word fair is such a complicated word. This is something we've talked about a good deal in my Exploring the Lord of the Rings class, because of course the word fair means two different things, right? It means blonde or light colored, and it also means beautiful. And sometimes we did a little word study of this in the Lord of the Rings, and sometimes he seems to use it clearly in one sense but not the other, or clearly in the other sense and not the one. And sometimes he seems to use it in a way that's open to understanding it in both ways, not, I think, in a way of identifying the two, like blonde is beautiful. That is to say, I don't think that that's what it means. Sometimes it seems to be merely a point of description. And not to mean especially beautiful, but just fair in the sense of blonde. But it's difficult. It's a complicated word, and his usage of it is often kind of ambivalent. It's hard to say sometimes when he's using it in a purely descriptive way, and when he's using
Anatar, he's telling the whole world that people like Celebrimbor and Galadriel and other Eldar who should know better were fooled. They were fooled.
Yes.
Because Sauron appeared fair. And that doesn't mean he appeared Caucasian or blonde, blue-eyed.
No. And even in that sense, it doesn't even mean he was pretty necessarily, right? I mean, that's more like the sense of fair and foul with Aragorn in the tavern, right? You know, to look foul and feel fair. Means something a little bit more vague and kind of, I don't know, ontological rather than simply descriptive.
When I talk to a lot of female fans, they're really ready for a hot Anatar. They're ready for him to be.
Oh yeah. Well, no, I'm not saying he shouldn't be hot. I think he probably will be hot, but yeah. But yeah, no, I certainly don't think that. I mean, I think that the majority, especially in like a Silmarillion context, I believe that the majority of the time he uses the word fair, he merely means beautiful or even good. And very much less often does he mean blonde or light colored. But yeah, it's hard. It's tricky. I could imagine. I mean, look, the elves, first of all, how much do elves change? physically. I mean, they change, they can change, right? Like but even if they don't, even if you assume that like, okay, you've got the one body, you've got the one Hroa, and it doesn't alter, throughout your very long elvish life. What were they like originally? Like, did they all wake up white-skinned at Cuiviénen? Do we know that for sure? I don't know that we know that for sure, or rather, I don't see any explicit reason for necessarily saying that. Or rather, to be even more generous about it, I don't think it requires a lot of wrenching of the canon to imagine that maybe it's not the case. I don't think I know that it violates the kind of imaginative canon, the head canon of a lot of Tolkien readers, but there is very little in the canon that actually would insist upon that. The only elves that I can imagine that really should be fair-skinned are the Vanyar, because they're described as generally being fair-skinned and blonde. But apart from that, I would not have a serious problem at all with a choice to depict the different kindreds of the elves as looking different, other than their hair color, like having more differences than, if their hair color differs, why not their skin? I don't see any necessary reason not to do that.
Do you know how many people are shocked at the many depictions of Legolas throughout many, many decades where he has raven black hair?
Right.
Because Tolkien never bothers to tell us.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, and of course, Legolas is a hard one, right? Because I think that Orlando Bloom's Legolas, probably, Bloom's Legolas and Mortensen's Aragorn are probably the two most iconic visual images that people have held on to over the years for, identified with characters. I think it'd be easier for people to get used to a different Frodo and a different, and a different Sam and even a different Gandalf perhaps than a different Aragorn and Legolas. I don't know. But in any case, certainly the blonde Orlando Bloom, that we got in the Peter Jackson film is certainly a very iconic image, and it would be hard for people to adapt from that. But honestly, there's no textual reason why it shouldn't be different. There really is not.
Absolutely. I'm with that. And if anybody wants a primer on what Professor Tolkien's attitude was about racism and race relations and racial political screeds, you need look no further than the way he handled the issue with his German publisher asking for proof about his Aryan ancestry.
His Aryan ancestry.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, so this was,
when they were story.
Right.
Great story.
When they were going to publish The Hobbit in German, and the Nazis were already kind of coming to power. And so he got this letter, which he called a highly impertinent letter, from the German publisher asking him for evidence of his Aryan ancestry. And he wrote this famous letter, which says, if you are asking, whether anyone in my family is Jewish, I regret to say that I have no ancestors from that,
greatly admirable people.
Great and admirable people. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Which was a delightful answer. But he was absolutely, I mean, the noun that he used for Hitler, we call them that little ignoramus. Like the like mindlessness of the race theory of the Nazis.
He called it pernicious. He called it a pernicious race doctrine.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, he had no patience with that, as much as he loved German things. And of course, he was greatly mourning. C.S. Lewis wrote about this same thing too, about how basically the way that Hitler kind of, colonized Norse mythology, or Germanic mythology, and how grieved, Tolkien and Lewis both were that this mythology that they loved so much had been taken over, as this like proto, this Nazi ideology, and of course both of them offended by how little Hitler obviously understood it, right, when he was trying to take it over. So, that was hard. But yes, they were, he was very much opposed to the, all of that stuff. It was
And he
completely
told his
outside his worldview.
publisher, he said, to hell with it. Well, he didn't say that, but he said he could let a German translation go hang. That's what he did say.
Yeah, exactly.
He was not afraid to lose business and lose money in sight of making a stand against that particular Nazi influence and that race doctrine. So I find it so surprising and ironic that decades later, here we are, where there's still some small, little tiny quadrant of people who believe that Tolkien's representation of all this whiteness and all this Northern Europeanness, blah, 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 supports their racist ideas. And I'm like, don't you remember that the fellowship itself is a construct of different races of people, especially Legolas and Gimli, who really had a lot of mistrust for one another. And it shows how not far off Tolkien was in full-on saying multiculturalism, good.
Yeah, well,
good stuff. Here's the equation.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's so there.
All the way back to the War of the Last Alliance, right? The joining together of peoples. I mean, if there are racial issues, right, dealt with in the Lord of the Rings, it's like between men and elves and dwarves. It's not ethnicities of men, of course. And so I agree. It's not the Haradrim aren't a problem because they're a different race. I don't even think he would use that vocabulary in any way to describe it. They're from a different place and maybe their skin is a different color, but they're not a different race. The elves are a different race. The dwarves are a different race. Yes. The Haradrim aren't a different race. They're described as men. They're spoken of as men. This was Sam's first battle first time seeing a battle of men against men, and he didn't like it much, right? It's not a battle of two races. It's a battle of men against men.
Exactly.
Question from the chat. A couple people joined in late and were like, Hitler, but what does Hitler have to do with Tolkien? And I just want to say Hitler has everything to do with Tolkien. So looking forward, like, what is there books that people can read to catch up on Tolkien's relationship with, Nazi Germany, his opinions on Hitler, and what the show may be about? Like, what are specific things that fans can read?
I would start with his published letters for sure.
Yeah, definitely. His published letters are a really great thing to read to get some more about this. If you want scholarly treatment of race in Tolkien, I would recommend Tolkien, Race and Cultural History by Dimitri Fimi, which is a wonderful study of sort of the issue of race in Tolkien. That's 2011, I think that book was. But
okay, and my one other question from is, was Tolkien woke?
I don't know. Was Abraham Lincoln woke? Was
good one.
It's good one. There's applying, very not only modern, but very passing, very sort of faddist labels to historical figures is kind of, it wasn't a thing. That was not a thing in Tolkien's time. So how can we possibly say? But I mean, if by that, do you mean was he, I don't know. I mean, I don't even know exactly how we would extend that. But I do think that
I think some of the concern is you brought up that Cliff brought up that Tolkien could just totally ignore the German market. Tolkien was not concerned about the financial rewards of his stories, no matter what. And there's plenty of scholarship behind that. So the pause I think a lot of fans are having is Amazon is the most profitable company in the history of the world, and how do you reconcile Tolkien's leadership of Middle-earth, where there wasn't a focus on returns, to Amazon's stewardship, which they must have a return. Or maybe they don't. Maybe this is Bezos' altruism starting to show.
I don't know. I mean, so I think that going back to some of the things that we've talked about before, I think that Tolkien, there was a lot of things that Tolkien writing, The Lord of the Rings in the 30s and 40s wasn't thinking about, things that he wasn't concerned about, things he wasn't interested in. One of the questions that I think never crossed Tolkien's mind at any point in his lifetime was, how are readers of color going to relate to my stories? Like, it was not on his radar screen. I can't imagine him ever having asked himself that question, not because he was racist, but because that was a question that was not relevant to his life, just something that he never thought of. But that's not a question that a modern adaptation can ignore. I think it would be irresponsible for a modern adaptation to ignore that question. So I think it's a perfectly legitimate question for an adaptation to be asking. And when you go, but at the same time, I don't think that necessarily means, well, therefore, because you should be thinking, because it's good to think about that, therefore you have a license to kind of do whatever you want. Like, let's just, change the story in kind of arbitrary ways in order to be sort of tokenist and inclusive in, our casting or whatever. That's not a good way to go about the adaptation. But again, I think that Tolkien does leave enough opportunities. If we look at the world that he created and what he said about it, not necessarily the preconceptions that we have about it, or even perhaps some of the preconceptions that he had at the time of writing about some of the things. I wonder if, I mentioned Prince Imrahil before, right? Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth. Dol Amroth, as I say, far south. It's somewhere around the latitude of Morocco, right? So then you would think that to be consistent with the world that Tolkien created, the citizens of Dol Amroth should be darker skinned, right? They should be. So Prince Imrahil I would not cast a white guy to play Prince Imrahil if I were following the directions that Tolkien gave. Again, does that mean that I think that Tolkien himself pictured Prince Imrahil as dark-skinned in his mind? I'm not saying that. He probably didn't. But again, that world building was stuff that he did later on. And maybe he would have done had he written it after he thought through the geography in those terms. I don't know, but it certainly gives any kind of license that is needed, I think, to an adaptation to think in those kinds of ways. And which is why I think the same thing about the elves. The three kindreds of the elves. Why is there an imperative that they should show me in the text where there's an imperative that they should all be white skinned? I don't know that one can make that case.
Indeed, when Tolkien was putting his main focus on the Eldar, he was more concerned in which group of them had never beheld the light of the trees.
Yes.
He never bothered to expound to the detail of how much melanin they had in their skin.
Absolutely.
For heaven's sake, people. You know what I'm saying?
I do. I mean, I really do believe that was a question that was almost completely irrelevant to Tolkien. So some people are asking why we're spending so much time talking about race. I think this is a really important question that's going to be on a lot of people's minds. The question arises from the casting, and we see people of color in the cast. Yep. And so the question is, what does this mean? And how does that, in fact, the fact that they've included people of color in the casting, how does that inform our expectations about the series and about what they're doing in the series? That's why we're talking about it.
Exactly. And it should be. It's an honest conversation that we're just going to have because there's some people who are still trying to have that hill they're going to stand on and die on that hill, saying that their Lord of the Rings experience has to be as white as porcelain. And it's really not that way. It's really not that way at all. You could go back to the 70s and look at how Ralph Bakshi almost certainly gave Aragorn a unique Numenorian background by making him look and have his pigmentation look so distinctly different.
Yes.
Which Justin has often compared to analogous to being an American Indian
Yes.
ethnicity with
Yes.
that type.
But
of maybe, but here's the thing. Peter Jackson got ripped at the Oscars by Whoopi Goldberg, who was hosting when Fellowship of the Ring was up for so many nominations. And she said to Peter in her opening monologue, "Well, where are all the black hobbits?" And Peter looked really sharply embarrassed. The camera was cutting back and forth to Ian McKellen and Elijah and back to the hostess. And Whoopi said, "And what would you call them anyways if you did? Blobbits? The black hobbits. Where are the blobbits?" And I mean, this conversation is over 20 years old. Everyone's been asking, where's the representation? This conversation is not new, okay?
Yeah.
But it's interesting that it wasn't until later in the game, when Peter put a lot of background actors in the Desolation of Smaug, we realized that Esgaroth, Lake Town, is populated with what would have been the destination and crossroads of a lot of nations and a lot of different regions, with a lot of different ethnic types of humans all there gathered in Lake Town. And that was showed full on with Asians and black people for the very first time depicted in one of his 6 Middle-earth films. It happened in Desolation of Smaug. And nobody hit the rafters going crazy. And there was no controversy about it. Within context of the secondary world, it all made perfect sense. But, here we are, it's almost 2021 now, and we still have to have these conversations because Amazon is going to make even more casting announcements coming up in the next weeks and months, and there's going to be even more conversation about it. So we might as well start now and say, look, it's like this, kids. we'll thank you. God bless you, Corey Olson, Tolkien professor, for coming up and saying it's not so challenging after all. Thank you for being
I
here.
really don't think so. I mean, again,
I agree.
Could it be done badly? Of course, it could be done badly, but it being done is not a bad thing at all. And not even, there's no reason to even think that it's like breaking canon in order to do that. It's really not.
Indeed. And I'm all about Mr. Cruz being a real hot Anatar. I'm all about that. But I don't know. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen next. We really have a lot of speculation that we enjoy. At the tail end of every episode of our Torn Tuesday show, we go to the back, to the bar, to the Green Dragon Inn, and we have a pint, and we decide to stop talking about legitimate stuff and then just speculate. Wild rumors, sitting in the back of the inn. Would you join me, Professor? Join me, and we'll have a pint. And let's speculate, okay? We have also speculated months ago, or maybe, Justin, was it like 2 months ago, that a certain Australian actor who was a certain gladiator in a certain Academy Award-winning Ridley Scott film, and he was also in a certain Academy Award-winning Ron Howard film about some beautiful mind or something. Have you been hearing rumors like that too?
I haven't, actually. But that's interesting. No, I haven't. That's very interesting.
Really? Yeah. We're hearing that there's all kinds of casting stuff going on that has been hush hush. And I like to speculate about the Russell Crowe thing. I really do.
Well, I think a lot of our core fans and audience, they're less concerned about someone of the caliber of Russell Crowe and more concerned about the caliber of a Tolkien expert on set. And you know what? We've heard back and forth.
That big a wave of seismic energy to know that they had brought Tom Shippey, back on board, or somebody like that to work as the center, the center of gravity for Tolkien questions. That would be great to know if they'd done that. Yeah,
it would be. The only thing I can say about that is that I agree that would be lovely to know, But at the same time, the lack of it doesn't lead me to despair, because one thing that I have found, in the decade I've been doing my podcast, there are a lot of people who know Tolkien really well all over the place, right? So lots of places I have gone, or adaptations that I've, come to, have found people that I'd never heard of and didn't know at all, who are really, really wonderful in their knowledge of Tolkien and in their respect for Tolkien. So, it doesn't mean they don't have somebody who's really good and helping them to really stay online. We just don't know who it is.
Everybody in the chat room is loving this conversation and wants to thank you both for having it. This has just been a wonderful. Corey, how often are you broadcasting yourself? I mean, what do you got going on?
I broadcast about 4 times a week or so.
Wow.
Tuesday nights, starting now-ish, generally, is when I'm starting. So on Tuesday nights, I do my Exploring the Lord of the Rings, where we're doing a sentence-by-sentence discussion of the Lord of the Rings. Our sessions are about an hour and a half to 2 hours long. Tonight is going to be session number 168, and we're only about 3/4 of the way through the Council of Elrond. So this is, I think, going to be session number 45 in the Council of Elrond that we're doing today. So
that is wonderful.
Looking at the tonight's discussion will be about the comments that Gwaihir makes about Rohan. We're going to be talking about the introduction of Rohan in Gandalf's narrative in the Council of Elrond. That's the paragraph we're up to. Anyway, so that's what I do on Tuesday nights. On Wednesday nights, I do the Mythgard Academy, which is a long-running series. It's essentially like an online book club where we do the viewers vote for to which books we're going to do. We alternate between a Tolkien book and a non-Tolkien book. We've been doing the whole History of Middle-earth series for many years now. We've done the first 10 volumes of the History of Middle-earth there, as well as interspersing it with other books that people choose. Currently, we're studying Dante's Inferno. Then when we finish that, we'll head back probably to the War of the Jewels, volume 11. Though we actually might possibly take a detour and do the new book that's coming out, The Nature of Middle-earth, that's coming out next year.
Oh, that's very, very exciting.
Yeah.
I had a very good friend of mine tell me that you guys did a whole podcast dedicated to charting out the Silmarillion episode by episode by episode of what a synopsis might be for a massive scale Silmarillion series.
Yes, that's the Silmarillion film project, which we've been doing for 5 years now. So Amazon totally following in our footsteps, by the way. We've been planning this long-running TV series. It's a completely theoretical adaptation, of course, which is why we're doing the Silmarillion, because nobody can do the Silmarillion. So we're imagining that we're doing the Silmarillion. So we've been talking through it. We're discussing season 5 right now. Season 5 in our show goes from the basically when Arathel leaves Gondor and when the men arrive in Beleriand up to the Dagor Bragollach. So that's what we're in the middle of discussing. We're in the middle of planning that out, and it's a really fun project. It's a fan-driven project. We have people doing art, and we do casting, and we do location spotting, and we do set design and props and costumes, and music. We have a whole musical score being composed, and we have scripts being written. Wait, sorry, what was that? Okay, wrong click. Okay.
Oh, sorry, that was something else. Okay, that's really, really, really cool. People can look you up and find these podcasts where at? Directly.
Yeah, you can go to the Signum University YouTube channel, and there are different playlists for all of the different broadcasts that I do. And then you can also go to mythgard.org, mythgard.org, and that will also have information on all of our archived stuff. You can get podcast feeds there. You can get the links to the YouTube channels and stuff. You can also follow us on Twitch, twitch.tv/SignumU, where I stream most of this stuff live as I do it as well. So you can look back at the hundreds of hours of back episodes for all of these things, or you can join me. You can just jump in and join me live for sessions that are going on right now. So
perfect. I just subscribed. There it is. Signum
there we
University
go.
YouTube channel.
Excellent.
How fantastic is that?
There it is. Twitch.tv/SignumU.
Perfect. Well, I hope that we're not keeping you from your Tuesday show, the show that Stephen Colbert loves to watch. So we better not keep you too long.
I think he's up to episode 127 now. He just retweeted my broadcast feed for episode 127, which suggests to me that that's where he is. So he's a couple months behind, but
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm loving it. It's super, super good. And it's a pleasure to have you with us to enjoy such such well thought out and adroit observations on what doesn't, it doesn't need to be, controversial. It just needs to be, we need to be open to all this wild creativity that is coming into play. And we need to watch and wait and see what happens next. And that's one of my favorite things to do, is to observe and report as a documentarian myself. So again, thank you very much, Corey Olson, for being with us here on Torn Tuesday. Directly on Twitter, it's Tolkien Professor, right?
Tolkien Prof, yeah.
Prof, Tolkien Prof. And we've got another big show next Tuesday. I'm going to have more details and more information about that motion picture, Ringer's Lord of the Fans, which has just been recut in a new director's cut with a new high definition upscale, and it's going to be coming around to a surprising place very soon. And we've got interviews and articles and more stuff about that coming up. We'll even have more casting announcements from Amazon as soon as we get them. And ladies and gentlemen, you have been tuning in to another great episode of Torn Tuesday here at theonering.net. Justin Sewell, do you want to say goodnight to everybody in the background before I sign off?
I have nothing to say except, Corey, it's been a long time coming. Don't be a stranger. I hope you come back.
I'd be happy to come back. That would be fun.
So much agreed. I'd be very excited to have you back, good sir. And we'll have another pint at the Green Dragon Inn sometime soon. In the meantime, stay safe and stay well there in Imladris. And we'll be seeing you guys online. For all the folks at home, you can follow theonering.net on all of our social channels, the One Ring Net. But the main website has a really great Advent calendar of holiday surprises and a new article every day covering the casting announcements and more stuff. So check out the main website, which we just redesigned. It's theonering.net, like a classic web browser. Try it, kids. You might like it. Check it out. And as always, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at QuickBeam2000 for more mischief and mayhem. Lovely, lovely to have you here as my guest, Corey Olson. And Justin, thank you for all the behind the scenes shenanigans. And to everybody out there, we'll see you next Tuesday, 5 o'clock Pacific time for Torn Tuesday. Until then, buenas noches y buena suerte. See ya.